Let's get right into it. Today we're taking a deep dive into a case that really shook Youngstown, Ohio, back in 2017, the disappearance of Shannon Graves.
Oh,
29 years old, and trust me, there's a lot to unpack here.
absolutely.
So to help us understand all the twists and turns, we've got an expert with us today, somebody who can shed some light on the complexities of this case.
Well, I'll certainly do my best to help break it down. It's a tough one for sure.
Now, before we get into what happened, let's paint a picture of Shannon's life before she vanished.
Okay.
The sources we've looked at, they paint a pretty consistent picture of her, don't they?
They do, yeah. Everything I've seen suggests she was a really bright person, friendly, caring, the kind of person who just left a positive impression, you know?
Yeah.
And that's part of what made her disappearance so shocking. I mean, February 2017, just gone.
It's hard to imagine what goes through the minds of her loved ones in those early days. That uncertainty must be agonizing.
Oh, absolutely. And that initial period, it's so crucial in a missing person case. The early response can really make or break the investigation, unfortunately. Sometimes precious time is lost. People hesitate to report it, or maybe they dismiss it at first.
Thinking she'll just turn up.
Exactly.
And in Shannon's case, months went by without any answers. Then, that devastating discovery in July 2017, her remains were found, and the details are, well, they're tough to hear.
Yeah.
Not only was her body found inside a freezer
Right.
in a home on Youngstown's south side, but it had also been dismembered.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that's a chilling detail, to say the least. To think that someone could do something so horrific.
It's definitely a detail that raises all sorts of questions. See, the way a body's concealed, especially in a homicide, it can be very revealing. Is it about just hiding the evidence? Or is there something more to it?
Yeah.
Could be an attempt to dehumanize the victim, or maybe a sign of uncontrolled rage, panic, you know.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It adds another layer to it all.
So when the investigation led to Arturo Novoa's arrest, and the details of how he concealed Shannon's body came out, it really got people talking.
I bet.
Novoa eventually pled guilty in May of 2019 to murder and dismemberment. 48 years to life. He was sentenced.
Wow.
That must have been a very difficult decision
Okay.
for both the prosecution and the defense, arriving at a plea deal, given how serious the charges were.
Oh, absolutely. Plea deals are always a balancing act, especially in a murder case. You've got the prosecution thinking about the strength of their evidence, the potential trauma of a long trial for the victim's family.
Right.
And, of course, the desire for justice. But then the defense has to weigh the risks of going to trial versus securing a more predictable outcome.
Yeah.
It's a lot to consider.
And in this case, it came out that Novoa and Shannon actually knew each other. Their relationship, according to sources, was tumultuous, to say the least.
Oh, really?
And ultimately turned violent. Sadly, this seems to be a common thread in many cases like this,
Yeah.
wouldn't you say?
It is. It's tragic, and something we really need to talk about more openly. Relationships that escalate to this level of violence, they rarely start with physical abuse. It often begins much more subtly with things like control, emotional manipulation, isolating the victim from their support network.
So for those of us who might be listening, what can we do? How can we be more aware of these red flags? What should we be looking out for?
That's such an important question. Domestic violence, it doesn't always look like what we see in the movies, you know? It can be a lot more insidious. We need to pay attention to the dynamics in our own relationships and those of the people around us.
Are there specific signs, behaviors you would consider like immediate red flags?
Definitely. Controlling behavior, that's a big one. Attempts to isolate someone from their loved ones, constant belittling, emotional abuse. These are serious warning signs. And it's not just about recognizing them, it's about having the courage to speak up for yourself or for someone you care about.
And that brings us back to Shannon. The trial revealed that Novoa didn't just commit the murder, he planned it out.
Wow.
And then went to great lengths to try and hide her body. Hearing those details, I can't imagine what her loved ones must have been going through.
The emotional toll in these situations is unimaginable. They're dealing with the profound grief of losing someone in such a horrific way. But then they have to endure the pain of a public trial, reliving the details, the accusations, the evidence.
It's heartbreaking. And the fact that he tried so deliberately to cover up his actions. What does that tell us? What was going on in his mind?
That's where things get really interesting and disturbing from a psychological perspective. You have this horrific act, this immense violence, and yet there's another part of the perpetrator's mind that goes into this, like, problem-solving mode.
Hmm.
How do I get rid of the body? How do I create an alibi? How do I avoid getting caught?
So it's like a complete disconnect, almost like he's detaching himself from what he's done.
Exactly. That level of compartmentalization is often seen in certain types of criminals. We think of organized crime, where individuals are trained to suppress emotions and just focus on the task. But in a domestic violence case, it can point to something much deeper, like a distorted reality, denying the seriousness of their actions.
So many questions about Novoa's state of mind leading up to this.
Right.
Was this a long time coming? Was there a specific trigger? Premeditated? I bet these are the kinds of questions that would keep forensic psychologists up at night.
Oh, for sure. And while we might never have definitive answers to all of those questions, the fact that he planned it, the steps he took to cover it up, it speaks volumes about his state of mind.
Killing to think about.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to try and understand these complexities, even if it's uncomfortable, because it might help us recognize warning signs, maybe prevent future tragedies.
Absolutely. The more we understand the psychology behind these crimes, the better equipped we are to identify those potential risks and intervene before it's too late. And that brings us to a crucial point, the impact of Shannon's case on Youngstown.
Yes, let's talk about that. This case, from what I understand, sparked a lot of conversation, action around domestic violence awareness.
It did. It's a sad truth that it often takes a tragedy to galvanize a community. But Shannon's case became a catalyst for change in Youngstown. It forced people to confront the reality of domestic violence, to recognize it can happen anywhere, to anyone, and to start those difficult conversations about prevention and support.
So, in a way, her story, as tragic as it is, has become a force for good, shining a light on a very dark issue.
That's a powerful way to put it, and I think that's what we need to focus on. How to take this horrific event and turn it into something positive, something that honors Shannon's memory and helps protect others.
I think that's a good place to pause for now. There's just so much to unpack here. This case is so multi-layered.
It really is.
You've given us a lot to think about already. We'll continue our deep dive into the case of Shannon Graves after a short break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. We've been discussing the tragic case of Shannon Graves and how her story has really sparked this conversation about domestic violence in Youngstown. It's easy to get caught up in the darkness of cases like this, but it feels like there's been this desire for change, this push towards creating a safer community because of Shannon's story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that shift, from reaction to prevention, that's where the real work begins. It's about educating young people about healthy relationships, recognizing those warning signs, and creating those safe spaces for victims to come forward. Vital steps in breaking that cycle of violence.
You mentioned educating young people about healthy relationships. What does that look like, practically speaking?
Well, I think for starters, it means having those open and honest conversations about what a healthy relationship actually looks like, about respect, communication, boundaries, consent. It's not just romantic relationships either. It's about teaching young people how to build those healthy relationships with friends, with family members, in the workplace even, just across the board.
And what about safe spaces for victims? What are the challenges there, and how can we help overcome them?
Oh, you're hitting on a really important point there. One of the biggest hurdles is overcoming that stigma surrounding domestic violence.
Yeah.
Victims often feel ashamed or afraid to speak out,
Right.
worried about being judged or not believed. And that's really where that community support is so crucial.
You've mentioned community support a couple of times now. What role can everyday people play in making their communities safer, more supportive for potential victims of violence?
It's not just about those big initiatives or policy changes, although those are important too. It starts with each of us being aware, being informed, being willing to take action in our own circles. It's about each of us. Think about it this way. What if we all made a commitment to learn the signs of domestic violence? To have those sometimes uncomfortable conversations, to offer support without judgment, and to just create an environment where victims feel safe coming forward. That's how we start to shift that whole culture.
Earlier, we were talking about some of the really disturbing aspects of this case.
Yeah.
Like the calculated nature of Novoa's actions, both in the murder itself and the attempted cover-up. You mentioned compartmentalization, but I'm still struggling to grasp how someone can commit such a horrific act and then try to hide it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around because it just goes against our understanding of empathy, remorse.
Hmm.
But what we find is, and this was fascinating, disturbing from a psychological perspective, is that this compartmentalization, it's often a defense mechanism. It allows the perpetrator to kind of distance themselves from what they've done, to create this psychological barrier that helps them function, even when faced with, unimaginable guilt and horror. And it's a chilling thought, but it often explains how someone can seem so normal while harboring such darkness inside.
So in Novoa's case, that compartmentalization allowed him to not only plan and execute this murder, but also go through those steps of concealing Shannon's body, creating an alibi. That level of detachment is hard to fathom.
And remember, the act of dismembering a body, it's not just about disposal, it's about power, even in death.
Right.
It's about trying to erase the victim, to deny their humanity, and that's what makes this case so deeply disturbing.
Yeah. It's like a final act of control, silencing Shannon forever. And yet, even with Novoa's conviction, there are still so many unanswered questions. We may never fully understand what led him to this violence. What was the final trigger? What went through his mind?
That's the nature of these cases, isn't it? Even with a conviction, a sense of closure, there are always pieces missing. But maybe those unanswered questions, they serve as a reminder to keep asking questions, keep learning, keep pushing for a deeper understanding of these complexities, of human behavior, the factors that contribute to this violence.
It's a sobering reminder that justice, it isn't always neat and tidy. There's often a messiness, a feeling of, well, it's incomplete.
And that's where the community is so important, supporting Shannon's family, continuing this conversation about prevention, creating a safer environment for everyone. That's how healing begins. It's a long process, but an essential one. It's about recognizing that even in the face of such darkness, there's still hope, a potential for growth, change, for a future where these stories become less frequent.
It's interesting you bring up hope because throughout this whole deep dive, that's something I keep coming back to. Despite the horrific nature of this case, there's also this sense of resilience, this determination to learn from this and create a better future. I think that resonates with our listeners.
I think you're right. People are drawn to true crime, not just for the sensationalism of it all, but for the insights it can offer. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths, ask those difficult questions, and think critically about our own roles in creating a safer, more just society.
And that brings us to another important point, the power of knowledge and the responsibility that comes with it. We often hear knowledge is power, but it's what we do with that knowledge that truly matters.
Couldn't agree more. That's why we always encourage our listeners to go beyond this deep dive, to do their own research, get involved in their communities, to be part of the solution, not just passive listeners.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. As we wrap up our deep dive into Shannon Graves' case, it strikes me that the takeaway here is multifaceted. We explored the heartbreak, the complexity of the investigation, the legal proceedings, the impact on the community. But we've also touched on the resilience, the calls for change, the hope for a future where violence doesn't define our lives.
And that brings me to a final thought for our listeners to consider. What steps can each of us take in our own lives and in our communities to create a safer and more supportive environment for those who might be vulnerable to violence? It's a question worth asking ourselves, and one that demands action, not just reflection. Really think about it.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. This has been heavy, hasn't it? But really important. Sometimes when we do these deep dives, it can feel like we're just observers on the outside looking in. But these stories, they impact us all in some way.
I think that's right. We can't just treat these events as something that happens to other people, somewhere else. Domestic violence, it affects every community. We all have a role to play.
You're right. And as you said earlier, it starts with each of us, taking responsibility, educating ourselves, being aware and speaking up. It's about shifting that culture away from silence and shame to one of support and empowerment.
Exactly. We have to move beyond reacting to these tragedies and start focusing on what we can do to prevent them. Education, resources, support systems. We need to help people before they reach that crisis point.
Thinking back on Shannon's case, there's this tension I keep noticing between the darkness of the crime and those glimmers of hope that have emerged from it. We see it in how the community responded, the changes people are pushing for, the conversations that are happening more openly now.
That's a good point. I think it speaks to something really powerful, the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of such a tragedy, there's this drive to make sense of it, to learn from it, create something good out of all that darkness.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway for our listeners. Yes, we've gone deep into the details of this crime, the investigation, the impact it had, but we've also seen how something like this can spark a movement, ignite real change, and hopefully lead to a safer world for everyone.
And that's the rewarding part of all this, Knowing that we're not just sharing stories, we're starting conversations, raising awareness, hopefully inspiring action. If even one person listening feels empowered to get help or to offer support to someone who needs it, well, that's an impact.
That's a powerful thought, and I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you again for joining us for this deep dive into Shannon Graves' case. It's been tough, but important. And to everyone listening out there, remember, you're not just listening, you're part of the conversation. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. We'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed this video and want to dive deeper into more cases like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video if you found the story compelling, and share it with your friends and family who might be interested in true crime and mysteries. By subscribing, you'll stay up to date with all our latest content and join a growing community of curious minds exploring the most fascinating cases. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything.